Welcome back to Our God and We. Before we get into the video, please take a second to subscribe or follow. It would mean the world to me and really help support this project. Thank you again and enjoy the video. Hello and welcome back to Our God and We. I'm your host, Stephen Stapleton. Today we are joined by Mason Laney. Mason is a 23-year-old Christian in his first year at Harvard Law School. Mason intends to work in the law for several years before, God willing, going into politics. Growing up, Mason was in a family that was only Christian by name first, and then later Christian by faith. Although growing up, he believed this conversion would spell the end of his family's troubles. It, in fact, only spelled the beginning of new ones. Christianity turned out to be far more complex than he initially understood it to be. Since then, his walk has been heavily shaped by years in public school and study at our shared undergraduate institution, Wheaton College. This walk has consisted of that ever-confusing grappling with commandments, faith, and reality, which I am so excited to discuss with him today. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce someone for whom I have immense respect, Mason Laney. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Stephen. That was very, very kind, very nice and serious.
I
Made
tried
me
to be.
almost solemn. Yeah, reflecting on all of that, I was like, oh my goodness.
I need to
sounds
be,
much more intense than I honestly would probably characterize it to the average person.
I have a lot of respect for you, a lot of respect for your journey and sort of where you are right now in life. Yeah. So getting right into it, I want to start with your testimony and then sort of work into some of the things that you're thinking about today. You mentioned that your family was Christian by name first and then by faith. How did that sort of come about in your early life?
Yeah, that's a good question, and also thank you. I appreciate the kind words. It's mutually felt all the way through. Not to mention we got like the Harvard Yale confluence here.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
I was making a comment to some of my friends at Christian Fellowship last night, saying like, oh, there's only so many good things that have come out of Yale, and you are one of them, one of the very few. So. That's what I'll say for that. I've got to defend my school too. This is the only reason.
Trying to avoid Boston over here.
Yeah, at some point. But yeah, no, that's a good question. By faith, by name, and actual by faith. I use that distinction typically to try to describe something that I don't think words are really good at getting to, and I also don't think that like Christians should engage in this sort of discussion or behavior or talk about kind of faith in this way typically, unless it's like your own faith experience.
Yeah.
Or at least maybe my family's, because I know them very, very well. We grew up in this context. And I think also they'd be okay with justifying it that way too, or characterizing it that way. And the reason I say so is because you're talking about like whether or not really there's maybe salvation there for you actually have given your life to Christ, and also whether your life has changed because of that belief. I always say that what you believe should affect how you live. And when you say you're a Christian, but you do everything that the world does, there's basically no distinction between you and your next door neighbor who's not a Christian, other than maybe that you go to church on Sundays and like maybe donate more to charity or something like that. That may mean something, at least in the sense that you have a different community, and maybe it affects your balance book a little bit more. But your heart probably doesn't look different, and the way that you treat people may not actually be different. Most Americans try to be kind. I know so many individuals who are not religious at all, and they care a lot about that. And so I think for our family, there's a lot of family history to go through. But the big thing is to say there was a commitment to Christ, but it wasn't actually manifested in our lives. And I can't say for sure for anybody else who's in that situation whether or not that means that they're saved or not. For me, I was treating God like a washing machine in my younger years. It was like a go off and live your own life, come back on Sunday, say, hey, I'm sorry, and go off and live your own life, because you really didn't. God was just like a part of your lifestyle. You didn't mean anything. Christ didn't mean anything. And so I was like 9 at the time, things kind of changed. A lot of craziness happens. I think that there's an element of truth to the whole idea that you have to suffer in order to realize how much you need God. And I think our family definitely suffered. I suffered. We went through many things that I won't go too into detail for, but basically kind of stuff that sets up family crisis. And obviously never easy to navigate. But in the aftermath of that, we all came out as Christians. My father, my mother, my brother, my sister, and me. I'm the youngest in my family, youngest of three. So being 9 years old at the time, actually I was probably just still 8 at the time when originally all this started, I had very little concept of what it all really meant. I just knew that my faith looked different and how I lived was different. And so we went from Boston, where we were living our lives as we had, to my dad getting a new job and moving down to Alabama, to now as like saved Christians. And that's the most important dichotomy to understand for me, at least in my context growing up, because like for the rest of my life, I lived with this idea that I had been like lost and now I was found. Now I was like chosen. Now everything was good. I was saved. My family was saved. Yeah, we had problems. Yeah, we were sinners, whatever, but like things were going to be good. Things were clear cut,
Yeah.
right? And that sets the stage for other things.
Yeah, you mentioned something, and I think it's something that, especially in a lot of faith communities today, people really, really struggle with, which is this sort of this tension between suffering and also being faithful. And how does your life really look different? Is faith worth it if you're still suffering? Um, how would you sort of describe that as you were sort of trying to figure out what does Christianity look like for me and my family in the midst of the suffering?
Oh, that's such a good question. That's a very painful question. There's two elements to that. There's two paths I could go down. One, there's the whole, like, is God still good if you're suffering kind of argument, right?
Yeah,
Um, and I used to find that very convincing of the whole question of theodicy, whether or not there can be a good God in a broken world and all of these other things. And I read a few books on the topic, Truth and Beauty by Andrew Clavin and The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. And also from my experience, I kind of shifted. And if I walk down that path now, we'll end up talking about it for too long. So I'll just leave it here and say that that path is wonderful and it's a great discussion to have at some point. But I think that once you begin to think about love and the emotions that we feel and the truths that we get to witness in our lives, and stop thinking about that question as being like a logical, theological one, meaning like, how can God be good if world bad? Like instead of thinking it like a
yeah,
logical equation, thinking of it in a poetic sense, romantically, as like this element of there's something beautiful to our story that we're living, to being able to love, to being able to like to hope for things and to overcome challenges. All of these things are part of a good story. And we couldn't live in a good story. We couldn't live and choose God and love God if we didn't have the ability to also fail, to fall, to make mistakes.
mm,
Obviously, there's many Christians out there who will disagree with some of the theological aspects of that analysis. But for me personally, that's how I've come to reconcile with that path. Obviously, more discussion there. But the other path, the other way you can take it, and this one's probably more personal, more experience oriented. So I think this is maybe a better path to walk down. Um, and honestly, it's best represented by what I think we as Christians often think of in terms of our faith. That it's almost like this transaction. And I operated on this as a good example from the dichotomy for a long period of my life, from the dichotomy of like not being a Christian to being a Christian. When I became a Christian, I was like, okay, there's a few terms that have met. It was like a contract. I was making a deal with God. And the deal was like, he saves me, so I get saved, and I give up some things that I want, right?
mm,
So I gave up some things that I wanted, which was like lying and being mean to people who I thought I should be mean to and being prideful. But the thing is, as I got older, the problem with that concept, especially when I was 9, is that contract, the terms actually became weightier to me because the opportunity cost of that decision became heavier.
yeah,
I started
yeah,
realizing, wait a moment, I could make real money if I cheated. If I was like being mean to people, this person really deserves it, honestly. They're like I can really hammer it home. And then on top of that, like especially once you become a teenage guy and you start actually being attracted to girls, the battle against lust is incredibly difficult. And
yes, yeah,
like I got to this point at 14, 15 where I was like, okay, God, I'm going to make a deal with you. I'm going to wait. I'm going to just wait for a few years. By 20, 21, I'll find the girl of my dreams. We'll get married and then everything will be okay. And I'll give it up for you, just out of the kindness of my heart. Newsflash, I'm 23, still single. So that is not, that was not the bargain I ended up actually getting. And the whole point is to say that like, you can't live in faith as a contract. You can't live in faith as expecting that you're going to get something for this amalgamous idea of spirituality, or else you're going to be stuck between two worlds. You're going to be stuck between the world of spiritual success and the world of material success. And the one that's always going to be more enticing is the one that you can feel right in front of you.
Yeah,
every single day. And it's not to say that the spiritual world isn't incredibly powerful and convincing and shape shifting in its ways that it actually impacts you. It's to say that we are human beings. We're subject to passions and temptations and all these other things. You can't conceptualize your faith in that way so logically. It's just transactional. I know a lot of guys that do this because it ends up just exhausting you.
completely.
Yeah. So,
Yeah,
yeah, baseline.
yeah. I find I'm going to be honest with you. I I find it ironic. Um, it's I think it's often when we go into the spaces that that are nearest to us that we also find we find barriers and different ways that we push against those spaces. So the fact that you view your faith as a contract and you're currently at Harvard Law and you're saying we can't be logical about this. We can't see faith in a way that is logical without our heart invested in sort of the ups and downs. I find that to be ironic in some senses, but and we're going to get back to sort of being in Alabama and how that very much has shaped your faith. But I want to kind of bring it back to the present a little bit here. In being at Harvard Law, like how has this changed the way that you've seen logic in terms of being applied to your faith?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what you're pointing out is something that, like, just in all frankness, it's a paradox that I think everybody, especially, and you can understand being at Yale too. It's like you've got to come to live within this strange tension, and this is again what I'm talking about by the tension between the spiritual world and the physical world of like material versus spiritual goals. Um, the head of Christian Fellowship here, wonderful guy, Pete, pastor, the first thing he says to all of us when we came in, like this is literally orientation time, we're all meeting each other, the first time he's getting to preach to all of us, he said, frankly, he was like, listen, all of you need to repent of the reasons you came to Harvard, was the first thing he started with. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, darn it.
Yeah,
Like, you're right, he's not wrong. Like there's
yeah,
and even to get here in the first place, it means that we put such a premium oftentimes on success, and that we may have traded off a lot of good things that maybe God had in store for us in exchange for things that were maybe born out of selfish ambition. And going to like the shrines, the national shrines to selfish ambition, is kind of what these places are. Like there's centers, household storage, like little silos of all the ambition in the world,
yeah,
and kind of being surrounded by it now. I'm like, man, one, I think those reasons in themselves, don't get me wrong, they can be powerful if used for the right ends. I think that like these places originally they're built and founded by Christians for Christians. And if used properly, they can actually further God's goodness and the vision that we have of our faith. But at the same time, if not used properly, they can do some terrible, terrible things to you. And so being surrounded by a lot of ambition and being very ambitious myself, I've had to live in this constant kind of tension between, okay, am I doing this just because I think it's something that I want, or is it something that God has actually asked of me? And so I think this also goes back to like the whole point again, where I'm saying like I think that we're going to get into this more, but I think a lot of Christianity is simply believing what costs you the least. What I mean by that is that a lot of Christians, I should say not Christianity itself, but more Christians, a lot of Christians will operate on this level, and I operate on this level all the time too, especially I found myself doing it here all the time, where it's like, hey, money's not that bad to seek after, because if I seek after money now, I'll have a bunch of money later, and then I can give it all away, right? Or you know what? It's not terrible that I keep like I don't know saying these terrible things or making these bad jokes to my friends, because like I'll be friends with them, and if I didn't make those jokes, they wouldn't like me, and if they didn't like me, I wouldn't be able to actually spend time with them. And if I didn't spend time with them, then they wouldn't be able to see that I'm such a good Christian and know and learn about God and all these wonderful things. And the thing is, what's interesting about that is actually in our world, because of how broken it is and crazy, sometimes actually those bad things do end up producing good. That's what's very confusing. Is sometimes you end up getting close to people because of really bad situations. Maybe you were a mean person, maybe you sought out selfish ambition and all these other things like that, and you end up in a place where you actually can be a light. Other times, no. And so I don't have an answer to that. I don't have an answer to all those situations and how to propose, like to seek it out. All I know is that here at Harvard, at a place which obviously I'm surrounded by it, constantly suffocated by that desire to fill one's own goals and to be great and all of those other pretentious things. you have to immerse yourself in the spiritual world. This is my ultimate point that I've been making a big roundabout to get to, is when I'm saying you're living within the tension of the spiritual and the physical, that means you have to constantly be within communities, reading scripture, praying, reminding yourself of those things that you actually fundamentally believe, because every single other thing around you in your day-to-day is going to testify to the opposite. And it's going to exhaust you. It's going to exhaust you. And the hard part too about immersing yourself in the spiritual world is it's going to tell you things you don't want to hear, first off, and two, that don't even seem pragmatic. That's another point. There's a million and one things to talk about in this area, but like C.S. Lewis would say that Christianity is supposed to be like practical. But oftentimes when you're actually immersed in the spiritual, what you find is that, again, you're witnessing the same sorts of context of tension that I was talking about, where it's like, hey, if I do this bad thing, maybe I'll end up being able to do a good thing later. And that's where it's hard to be able to make decisions. Or you're specifically in a situation where it's like, do I say this thing, this honest thing to a person, even if it's going to hurt them, right? And that's not a yes or no situation. That's not a right or wrong. It's just gray. And so you can't live in faith assuming that there is just like always this one perfect, good, spiritual, right thing. And that then by immersing yourself in spirituality, things are going to be okay. So that's why this is a
Yeah.
nuanced answer. I can't just tell you, go read your Bible, you're going to be fine. I'm telling you, you're going to go read your Bible and you're going to get worse. You're going to get worse. Like that's often how it works. Is you read your Bible and you're like, man, I still don't know what to do. Like, I'm still lost. I'm still broken. I still feel ambitious. I still feel lonely. Like, all of those things are still going to be the case. But the big question amidst all of it is whether or not you still have faith. And that's a deeper question we can talk about more, but I'll take a moment because I've been rambling for so long.
Yeah. Yeah. That's profound. And I think that is so, so wise. There is, I think, especially contemporarily, if you think about, Christianity as it is practiced primarily in the United States today, there is sort of this push from both sides as to, oh, it's so obvious. This is what you do. This is the right thing to do every time. And there is no gray. And I actually am really glad you were able to sort of bring that up as an element of what faith has meant to you, is sort of living in this gray, growing to like accept the gray in a sense, and still being faithful despite the gray.
Yeah.
Which I think can be very hard. Like, it can be very difficult, especially at institutions. You being at Yale, you being at Harvard, especially at institutions where you there's this signaling as if there's always a right answer in every context for every question. And so having that almost opposite approach to what faith is, and to approaching faith really, is, I think, very wise and also very difficult to cultivate.
It's a humility for sure. I think that's the biggest step. The biggest step is humility.
Yeah, but I mean, even to that point, it's a humility, and then it's also it's there's an active element, I think, too, to living in the gray. In that, to live in the gray, you have to understand that there's echo chambers, and you have to understand what is in both. You know what I mean? You have to understand, like, that people think things differently, and that not always is it right, wrong. Sometimes it's just different. And when it comes, I think, to what to do in certain situations, sometimes being faithful is recognizing where God is placing you and what God is compelling you to do, and also recognizing that this is not a one size fits all.
Yes. No, there's almost never a one size fits all. Almost never.
Yeah. Not completely.
Yeah, I don't know. That actually reminds me of an interesting debate I had here, because you have all sorts of conversations with lawyers of differing varieties of Christian here, and one of the people I talked to, very, very like kind of, I guess you'd say kind of traditional, conservative in faith, and because of that, we were discussing whether or not, if you could, you should ban lying in government. Right? If you were as like a governing agency, something like that, you could say, hey, it's illegal to lie now. And my whole point and my whole discussion in those things is that, like, yes, it says in the Bible, you should not lie. And I think Jesus' life testifies to not lying. At the same time, there's a deeper question to that of, like, there's obviously situations we always pose, like, should you lie to the Nazis about like having Jews in your house or something like that? That's obviously the typical question of like weighing two different things. But an even deeper one, when you ask like the governing side, and this is also true in individual life, is what's the penalty? What's
Mm.
the penalty? Because like making something illegal, saying something is bad, is only one part of it. The next part is to say, okay, and then what do you do in response to it? What do you do in response to it? Do you put the person in prison? Do you fine them? Do you slap them on the wrist? What's the response? What's the
Yeah.
response to that thing? And that is where you actually start probing into the deeper moral questions. Because this is the problem with these truisms. The truisms, and this is going to be a big point that I really am hoping to make throughout this interview. Is the big thing of saying I hate truisms. They annoy the crap out of me because you say something. It's just the problem. You say something like "don't lie," right? And that's the first thing. And the person looks at that and says that's the moral like paradigm that they're operating on. That's the most important axiom. But if you ask a deeper question of, okay, what's beneath that? What does that mean then for the person? What does it mean for your life? Because that's what the penalty is asking. What does that mean for the person who's going to be facing it? Then they have to start weighing actual moral realities, such
Mm.
as, okay, if we imprison them for this, what does this mean for how they live? What does it mean for their family? What does it mean for their balance book? What does it mean for all of these other things? And that's what actual morality is. What actual morality is weighing things. It's weighing goodness and badness. It's weighing whether or not you're doing like the right things versus the wrong things. Aristotle had it right from the beginning when he was talking about this idea of seeking out like the golden mean. In truth, most of our lives are lived seeking this balance between not doing too much of one thing and not doing too little of the other.
Yeah.
And like that's why we needed Jesus. But obviously, there's that's also kind of a truism in itself. So I'd have to go a little bit deeper to explain.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I to push back slightly, I think on that. I think there might be some people that would say, well, what's the negative of doing too much good? To be
Hmm.
honest with you, if I mean, obviously the world doesn't operate that way, but if I personally decide, faith or no faith, that I'm going to do what I believe is morally good and do the most of that, then really what's the downside? Like there's like how does that negatively impact?
Yeah, and that's a good question on its face. There's a great story in the Bible, obviously, that deals with this question, where the rich man comes to Jesus and is like, hey, hey, I've done all these things, I've followed all the commandments. I want to be your follower. And Jesus says to him, okay, yeah, it's true, you have. You've done a great job. Here's one more thing I need you to do. I need you to sell everything you have and give it all to the poor, and then come and follow me. And the rich man's like, man, I can't. He just walks away so sad. He's like, I can't do that. What? Like, I sell everything I have, give it to the poor. But there's a deeper question there too. Like, I think for all of us individually, especially for me, like being where I am at this institution, um, and like being in America, being a person who still has money in my checking account and all of these other things, is I clearly haven't sold everything and given it all to the poor. And I
Mm.
actually think that if I probed this question, that there's a deeper problem within the idea of me going and giving it all away to the poor, right? If I go and do that right now, it means that all the things that have been gifted to me, all the talents that maybe God has given me, I may be just going and saying, you know what, this is the commandment. The commandment is that I give everything away to the poor. I'm holding on to nothing. I'm taking nothing. And kind of like the early Christians, you don't even actually procreate because you think that the world's going to end right around the corner and it's all just about living for Jesus, right? Because you're going to do as much as you possibly can in accordance with those commands. So it's not necessarily that like you're not trying to do as much good as possible. It's actually you are trying to do as much good as possible, but that our world is not so simple that it can be cut and it can be so cut and dry. Meaning I can't just say go and give everything you have to the poor because there's other moral consequences to that decision. The goal
Mm.
is to be as good as possible. So I would say, like in response, I think you're right. We want to model our lives after Christ as best as we can because He is the Nomos and Sikis. He's the living law, the Word become flesh. Like we want to live our lives as He did because it's the perfect balance. He was able to balance
Yeah.
the things that He needed, but also actually giving back to the people around Him, living it perfectly. And so that's more what I'm getting at. Not about like trying not to be good, but more not idolizing one command as the only way to live because you actually end up exchanging other moral realities in the process.
Completely. And I actually think that gets to another point that is become an ever increasing problem, especially in Protestant Christianity, which is you overemphasize one thing that you think is really important. And if nobody else overemphasizes that, let's create a new church. This is our people. And so you sort of separate yourself based on what your interpretation of morality is at that point in time.
The div school coming out for you here, Stephen.
It's funny. Being at a place like Yale Div is interesting because I think you see everybody has their thing, their thing that they are hinging their life on. And there's not. Some of them I think are really good, but it can break, I think, some of the continuity that can come from engaging with other people. Recognizing that the ways in which we engage with morality and with faith, really it's a conversation between all of us as a community. It's not as individual, I think, as we make it, nor is it as landlocked and isolated as we make it. And so if you're going to take your thing, and this is, for example, if you're like, I'm selling everything, that is the commandment, and that is everything I'm going to push for. I wouldn't even necessarily say that is bad, but you get to an interesting point when you are failing to love others because they can't walk necessarily in your same footsteps with your convictions. Not to say that for them not to walk with your convictions is sinful, because I think that everybody's has different convictions in general. One of the things that I think, me personally, that I'm really convicted on is actually kind of to your point. I don't see myself ever being able to be wealthy and feel like okay with that. But that's like my own personal conviction. I feel like to force that upon someone else would then create a barrier of love, which even then goes, I think, back to your earlier point of how can we deal with suffering if love is not our first motive? Because ultimately, that is everything that we as a community are trying to hold together in the ways that I see it, is figuring out love and figuring out the ways that love operates in relationship to one another.
Yeah, and I think the deeper question, maybe it's a more true, like I seek out the truth and want a consistent logical explanation for faith still regardless, that I then struggle with that kind of deeper question of saying one thing may be good for you, but you also don't want to judge it in another person, is morals obviously should be consistent, right? Absolute.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's very difficult then to sit down with people and tell them, hey, maybe for you it's okay to buy the Lamborghini, but for him it's not, right? And that's hard to draw in a church, especially in a church body, when you're talking about living collectively, right? This is what Paul was talking about with the whole eat like some people with fruits and vegetables, all this other stuff like this. It's how do you navigate within a community people who have very different conceptions of what Christ has asked them of, and it because of faith, because of what it is, and it applying to other people. We want to go out and talk to other people, like my friends here at the law school who don't believe in God, and I'm trying to find a way to explain to their experience, hey, this is what it means to live as Christ would have us. And they're like, well, which Christian? And I'm like, I don't know. I know Christ, you model yourself after Christ, but at the same time, everybody's modeling themselves differently. So it's obviously there has to be some line of truth, some sort of point at which we say, hey, this is what you should do. I draw that obviously at Christ's life. What that means, I think, is going to be broken. I actually think that in all of our lives, the way that I justify it in my head, if we're talking about you got a scatter plot, and you draw your line of best fit that's between all your stuff, I say hey, listen, none of us are all perfect in this. None of us are all perfect in this. I think my life's an imperfect model. I spend my life learning from other Christians because there's so many things I don't know, and there's so many things that I do wrong. And I may actually think for a period of time that I'm doing something right, and then at some point the Holy Spirit reveals to me, hey, this actually hasn't been the way that you should be living. And honestly, that explains the variance more to me. It's not that there isn't an actual good. That's Christ's life. It's that because we're broken, because we're human, we in our capacities cannot actually perfectly model that. Some of us will do well in some areas and then fail in others. And it's just how it is. And because we're broken too, we also don't really always know what those areas are. So I'm not going to turn to you and say, hey, you shouldn't buy the Lamborghini as much. I'll just say, why are you getting the Lamborghini? Because it seems like maybe that money could be spent on something else, right?
Yeah, completely. It's interesting, I think, striking that balance. You'd mentioned earlier that the way that you see faith is sort of in this sort of gray of trying to figure out what's right and wrong. And I almost want to contrast that between the gray of what faith is, what personal faith, and sort of a church's desire to live in this sort of black and white morality legalism. Like, how do you legislate? This is what our church stands for. Or how do you go, I have a personal faith that's in the gray, but I need to find a church community that cannot live in the gray.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think this is something like that's been a limitation on laws throughout all of history. I think this is something the Greeks pointed out originally. I'm not 100% certain. Nearly certain it's them that talk about like laws being capable of compelling actions but not cultivating virtue. So it's the whole idea that like I can lay down in my church a set of rules for you and tell you again all the truisms. Don't lie, don't be greedy, don't be lustful, all these other things. But in truth, that doesn't actually mean that you won't feel greed or like have a desire to greed or develop into like be able to fall very quickly and easily into a habit of greed or lust or all these other things. What it does mean, though, is that you have this sense of what you should and shouldn't do, right? Because there's a cost, there's a consequence to doing that thing. One is like it goes against your church community or it goes against your God, anything like that, right? But the deeper thing that actually impacts how you live and who you are, I think, is relationships. And I mean that in the sense of like not just with other people or like with your father and mother, but like with God too. That impacts who you are. It changes you fundamentally. We have this beautiful thing as human beings that we can live in a pluralist society. Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, was very secular. This is where I think she actually gets very close to the truth, where she's talking about like this idea that like what makes us really special as creatures is that we live in like plural societies, right? That we seek out what she refers to as action, and really that's like this idea of deviating from some standard mean. And
What would
like,
you consider a plural society, if you could
oh
define
yeah, that's a
that?
good. What she means by plural is literally just like plural, as in more than one person, right?
Oh,
Like she's
okay.
meaning like literally numbers, because like we have again, it's Aristotelian at its core. Like we have needs that others, not only others, can fulfill with them, right? And so because of that, when we live in community with people, it actually changes who we are. And I think for me, when I then look at the question of like how do you live in community? How do you have a church body that like lays out like a set of rules or has a set of standards and issues and all these other things? Obviously, that matters. It matters to have something to stand on foundationally, but those are laws that are meant to reflect your relationships and how you live. And so what matters more than anything else, again, this is I'm drawing on a lot of Greeks here, this is the Stoics, that like you need like a king who actually embodies those virtues for the people, or else it means nothing. In the church body, that means that the elders first are actually holding themselves to that. But it also means that the individuals of the church are living in accordance with that. Why? Because we have the ultimate example, again, the Nomus and Sikis, who is God, who is Jesus, right? Jesus who became the perfect embodiment of the word. And so we have to model ourselves in that way. But I think there's a much deeper and closer to home reality there, where this is where maybe we can talk something more about actual experiences, because obviously you can say all these things like in theory and say like, oh, you need relationships, you need to be kind, you need to like all these things about the limitations of life. But then you actually get into a church community with real broken people, and there's a lot more questions that are raised because of that, and it impacts you differently.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of which, I kind of want to draw that back to your testimony a bit. When your family becomes Christians, you move to Alabama, correct?
Yes.
Living in Alabama and then going to a more broadly evangelical college like Wheaton College. What was sort of your experience in kind of integrating yourself into church communities?
Hmm. Hmm. Oh man, there's a lot to unpack there. My initial experience in Alabama was the chosen one Messiah complex, where it was like my faith was my own, right? And maybe my
Yeah.
family's too. Like I had a relationship with my parents. My parents were the ones who brought me to Christ. And so like they were also chosen ones. But then the people in church didn't live their Christian lives like I expected them to, right? Like they didn't seem to take their faith so sincerely. They would lie. They'd say mean things to each other. They'd be like super selfish. And I was like, why are you guys acting this way? You're supposed to be kind. You're supposed to give things away. You're supposed to live this way. Like this is my conception of Christianity. And it's not to say that all of them like, and this is my always my problem in the South, especially it's the Bible Belt. There's so many people who call themselves Christian, and there are many Christians. It's just a question of who is living their life in a way that actually embodies that faith. And this was the hard part for me was that I developed this like kind of habit of condescension where I would look around and say like, hey, all these people aren't living in the way that I suppose they're supposed to. It's very puritanical. It's like, hey, you're not doing this one thing. You're not giving a tithe of your little monthly allowance. I was a kid, so obviously it's nothing. But I was like, you're not doing that, and you're supposed to do that. So you're not a Christian. Or maybe you're a Christian, but you're not as good of a Christian. And those sorts of mentalities, as much as they like are obviously not good on their face, they also end up kind of matriculating into other parts of your life, and they don't actually they're not sustainable. And as is always the case, Andrew Clavin has a great line on this. He says that when you live in lies, you end up bumping into a lot of invisible brick walls, and it's basically the idea that like when you do something that's not sustainable with your faith, it tends to be the case that you discover it, and maybe you
Yeah.
don't know it's that thing, but you'll run into it. And so, yeah, that's like the big thing is like, is there's obviously more to that story of saying, like, I ran into a lot of brick walls, come my late high school years. And our family ran into a bunch of brick walls as we kind of lived our lives with this sense of this is the one way that you do things. And if you don't do those things, you're not doing what's right. You're not being a Christian, and we're going to stand against it. And what that happened in my family specifically, in my understanding of it, obviously there's a lot of nuance to anything with families, but it ended up causing isolation because that's what happens when you lay down that sort of puritanical standard of saying, this is the only way to do things. There's a point when you have to do that. There's a point. Like, it's like literally you're murdering people. We can't allow you to keep doing that. But most cases aren't that. I'm going to be honest with you. Most cases aren't that. So,
And usually that's handled, I think, outside of a church
yeah,
body.
outside the church body, I would say go get some other figures of authority for that. But yeah,
Some that may or may not possibly be armed.
yes, maybe. There's also probably some deeper issues there. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
with murder, I would assume.
yes, I would agree.
Yeah. That's definitely. And I think that that's really interesting. There's a sense in which, especially in church communities, whether people admit to it or not, there is, I think, an innate sort of comparison game that goes on
Mm,
of
mm,
a you weren't at church last Sunday, you
yeah,
know, but it's really interesting because I think when you have that sort of these sort of vying for like more spiritual authority, which is again crazy to even think or say, considering spiritual authority does not come from your actions, from you. I mean, that like Orthodox Christianity, like that's sort of the general assumption. Of course, there's always outliers who believe other things. I'm going to say for the broad majority of Christians, do not believe that you can bestow upon yourself spiritual authority
mm,
without the presence of the Holy Spirit and God. That being said, I think it's really interesting the differences between sort of what the church supposedly says in terms of like how Christians are supposed to act within our congregation and how Christians really act in community, in
yes,
relationship with one another.
yes,
Which, I mean, even then goes back to your point of virtue versus legality. And you can't legislate virtue. How do you see, I think, in your life specifically, in going through your church communities and getting to Wheaton, and then now being at Harvard Law, how do you see your path eventually getting into a place of studying legislation, knowing it is an imperfect vehicle for virtue? See this as something that is, I think, and I this is obviously going to be a bit of a hypothetical question, because of course it's helpful. But do you see this as something that I think is helpful and beneficial to the course of virtue within our society?
Yeah. This is like a question from our political science senior SEM back in the day.
Oh, I know.
Steven, good days, good days. Yeah, I know. Well, I'll repeat it, but obviously you know for the classic Wheaton experience, we talked about a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
And honestly, like I'll drive a more like experience based wedge, individualistic kind of perspective here, just for the sake of, I think, making it a little more personal as an explanation of something like this, rather than something more theoretical. My experience at Wheaton was kind of witnessing. It was running into all those brick walls I was talking about. That's what I'd say. I think my freshman year was like running head first into a brick wall of saying like, hey, I've got it all figured out. I'm the best Christian. I'm the chosen one of God in many ways. Like my life's going to be perfect and great. I'm going to be successful. I'm going to be loved, all these things. And it's not to say that like Wheaton didn't end up being awesome. I loved it. But that first year, it was all about like thinking I knew things that I did not. And that's the most important part of a liberal arts education. I think that's also the best part of doing it in a Christian liberal arts institution, is that you actually get to see, hey, yes, one, you don't know a lot of things. And a lot of people that freaks them out in liberal arts, because you're like, wait, what does that mean? What does it mean for our lives? What does it mean for how we live? Especially as young people are like, you're trying to find an explanation. You're trying to figure out who you are and how you fit into this broader world. And in Wheaton, there's people who have grappled with those questions and understand the gravity of them, and then can say to you, but you can still have faith, because faith is ultimately the thing that actually will help get you through this, because it's true. It's true. These things are true, and truth matters, and it actually impacts how you live. So for my experience in Wheaton, it was realizing my own limitations in order to get to this point. I think the same thing applies with good laws. I think the same thing applies with life in general, all of these other things, is that like the best educations you receive are the educations that teach you all the things you don't know. So I know it sounds terrible, but like it's kind of true. When you walk out of a class, you should have learned a lot of things, but you should also have learned, hey, there's a whole list of things I didn't even realize were out there, and I still will never figure them out. Because that's the most fundamental part of living, is to realize that we as humans, like, and also this world, is incredibly complex, and we're limited creatures. And so I think the same thing with laws. I walk into a legal institution of any sort, and I'm not going to ever assume that the law can fix things right from the outset. That's the first assumption that most legislatures, most people here will take up, especially at a law school, to like then come out and give a harangue against the law, is like the opposite of what I would ever be expected to do. But like, I'm going to be honest with you, law is limited. It's limited. Like everything we're learning here is about ordering the world, and it can do great things to order the world. But when laws become too constraining, just like with living your life, if you do too much of one thing, it becomes bad. It ends up hurting other moral things that we care about. Same thing happens with law. So I don't look at the law as something to be idolized fully beyond its capacity. And I don't look at my life that same way. I don't think people should live their lives in those ways. I think the most important thing that we can learn in our individual lives, especially when you're going through suffering, is not to consider it in terms of, hey, like this thing should be this way. Like my life should be perfect. I should be with the girl of my dreams right now, or whatever. Or I should be having the job that I want to have. Or this law should be affecting this thing in the world. Like this immigration policy should change everything. No, it's to look at it and say, okay, there's a mistake, there's a failure, there's a shortcoming, something like that. Clearly, there's things I don't know. Clearly, there's something beyond my control. Whose control is it actually in? Whose control is it actually in? And that's the question that has brought me back to Christ more than anything else. And it's not to say that obviously within the law, sometimes it's like, well, it's in the hands of the judiciary or something like that. But like those questions obviously are much more like superficial. What I mean though is that if you really keep digging of like whose hand is that in, whose hands is that in, you're going to end up with a first mover. You're going to end up with the person who's actually in control. It's something greater, something bigger going on. And that orders your life. It doesn't always give hope. I can't explain. For me, this works, and I don't know if everybody else it's going to be as compelling to them too. But discovering my own depravity for a man who thought that he was the chosen one, like literally, like that was my starting point with Christ was like, hey, I'm making a bargain with you. Like I'm going to be the one in exchange for giving up all of these things. And like discovering all of a sudden, wait a moment, I'm I'm nothing in this world. I can change things, but everything will be devoured by time. Like everything, time will destroy it all the things that I would ever think were worthwhile. And suddenly realizing it's because it's not about me. It's never been about me. It's about something much better than me.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And you need that, I mean, to some extent, that sort of even self-assured nature that I think is actually really admirable about you kind of pushed you to a point to get to Harvard Law. Like I don't think, as someone who's at Yale, you're at Harvard, I don't think you can get to an Ivy League institution without at some point in your life believing, I have it all figured out. I'm correct. Point
Yeah,
blank.
that's probably true.
Like genuinely, that is the type of insane confidence you need. But then also getting to that point where you recognize and can humble yourself to come to the point of saying, like, I don't. And there's actually beauty in that. There's beauty in not knowing. And I think that's really awesome. Before we leave, I want to do a quote. So near the end of the podcast, I'm going to tell you a quote. You're going to explain what you're thinking through, how this quote is hitting you in a sense. And then later, after we talk about it, I'll tell you who said the quote and in the context in which they said it. So you'll be doing theology in conversation with people who some of them are not Christians, but I think in ways that they talk about God, faith, and society, very influential.
I'm going to be like, oh, this is a great quote. It applies to what a life. And you're going to be like, well, it was said by Hitler. Like,
No.
okay.
No, I will say every this quote is coming from someone I respect.
Okay.
And someone who's been influential in my life. Yeah, okay. I began by saying that one of the paradoxes of education was that precisely at the point when you begin to develop a conscience, you must find yourself at war with your society. It is your responsibility to change society if you think of yourself as an educated person.
Interesting. That's a very intriguing quote. This reminds me of G.K. Chesterton said that without education, we'd be in a horrible and deadly danger of taking educated people seriously. And so when I hear that, that's my knee-jerk reaction, especially being a very limited individual. I think there's two elements there. One, obviously, it's true to some extent in the sense of when you learn, you discover that the things that people take as true are often just taken for granted as true. These questions of God and man and science and all of this is what the West is in many ways built on, is this skepticism. And so when you actually become educated about the world and you learn about the world, you're like, wait a moment, these things don't all add up in the way that we thought that they did. At the same time, I think that you can't then fall into the kind of habit that made G.K. Chesterton say what he did, which is to then think you've actually got it all figured out because you're educated, that you know better than the society. Oftentimes, we assume that, especially in educated realms, that because we're smart and because we have resources and all of these other things, that we know better. We can understand things better and all these things. But things are the way that they are for a reason. People have done things the way that they have for a very long time. And maybe you can rationalize through hey, let's fix this system and make things a little bit better. But it's actually very, very dangerous and more difficult to do that than often presumed to. So I think my knee-jerk reaction to it is to say it depends upon your emphasis. If you look at it and say hey, society's messed up, because it is, and we make all sorts of terrible mistakes and do terrible things, and it needs to be rejected by people who are capable and knowledgeable, then yes, education starts with you saying, hey, my society needs improvement. I need to challenge it. I need to challenge the assumptions. That's what it means to become educated. Or you can take the other emphasis of saying, To become educated is to realize that, yes, maybe not everything within society lines up in the way that you think it does, but it's also, again, taking my original definition of it, which is realizing all the things you don't know. To become educated is to realize, hey, wait a moment, that we're part of something much bigger, something much beyond my control, actually. So then you take this emphasis and you say, it's not that I should necessarily confront society with my truth, right? With my truth, but with the truth. That is, hey, like, there are problems in this world, and I think that these are problems, but I'm not going to come at you and say that I know the answer. I'm going to say our goal is to pursue this thing, and although we're limited, it's worth pursuing it. Obviously, that's never going to be, like, neither of those answers are going to be satisfactory because it depends upon the situation, context, again, whatever. But I don't know who said that, because I don't know. I'm at a loss for who would have said it.
I find it, I think, actually really incredibly profound where you went with that, because I think the person who said it would almost entirely agree with what you said. But you were in conversation with someone who did not have higher education, is considered to be one of the wisest writers of the 20th century, a poet of the civil rights movement. And in his essay, A Talk to Teachers, that quote comes from James Baldwin.
Interesting. I would never have thought so. Intriguing.
Yeah.
Intriguing.
And I think it's so fascinating, because I think a lot of the wisdom within his writings comes from an education that he almost receives by seeking the truth within society that society is unwilling to confront within itself. And so I thought it was really fascinating how you almost went there, not even knowing, I mean, that his work kind of surrounds that. And that was incredible. Final question before you leave. Without naming a quote unquote, correct or orthodox answer, why are you a Christian?
Man, jumping right in from James Baldwin to the heavy questions here too. That's nuts. Yeah, and on the side, just to say, I think Baldwin was an incredible writer in himself. He wasn't a Christian, right, though? Am I correct?
He was not. No.
Yeah, I don't believe he was. But that's interesting. I definitely would like to learn more on that side. I'm trying to think now. This is difficult. Why am I a Christian? Oh, my gosh. For a man who just said that everything needs to be nuanced and is difficult to bring down to one simple truth, it's very difficult for me to give you a single answer, but I will. For the purpose of the exercises, I will. There's the academic response, and then there's the actual gut felt response. The academic response is what's true matters to me, but what's true matters deeply to me. And I think the truth is the story of Jesus. I think he is the embodiment of truth, of the law, of how to live, of all of those things. The gut felt response is that I desperately need God. I desperately need God. I've seen it in my life, and this is where I can't get away from it. Other people may come to a point of like academic, like rational, logical disagreement with God and with Christianity, but I can't get away. Even if I got to a point where I was like, there's no way this guy is right, I still couldn't stop following him, because I know that in my heart of hearts I am broken and lost and alone, and if I'm not with him, he's the only one who could save me. And so, and he has saved me. He has saved me. He's imbued me with the breath that I now am able to return with words and speak of his greatness. That's my single goal and service in this life, is because I've been given something I don't deserve. I need him.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And it has been a pleasure being able to talk to you.
It's been a great time, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me. As always, God bless. You're a wonderful man.
Thank you. All right, and that'll do it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and follow. It really helps support me and the communal project of Our God and We. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next time.